It's a day number 3, second session, the response of the international system. Our first speaker is online, and it's Artie Imsils, the attack against UNRWA. Artie, do you hear me?
Members of the jury, my name is Artie Imsils. I am a professor of international law at Queen's University in Canada. I appear as an expert on Israel's attack against UNRWA. This statement is drawn from my publicly available submissions made before the International Court of Justice on behalf of the State of Palestine on 28 April 2025, much of which was affirmed by the court in its recent advisory opinion of 22 October 2025. I appear before you today in my personal capacity. In the brief time I have, I'd like to make 3 points. The first of these is a reminder that UNRWA's mandate is an essential element of the permanent responsibility of the United Nations for the question of Palestine. This responsibility originates in the unsuccessful attempt by the General Assembly to partition Palestine without the consent of the Palestinian people in 1947, and of course the ensuing 1948 Nakba. In 1949, the General Assembly created UNRWA to provide direct relief and works programs to the Palestine refugees until their plight was resolved in accordance with international law. But these rights have never been allowed to be realized. Because of Israel's prolonged violation of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including to return and to self-determination, the need for UNRWA is as pressing today, if not more so, than it was in 1949. Operationally, UNRWA has provided generations of Palestinians with education, health, relief, and social services, and during emergencies, humanitarian aid in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory. For these reasons, the necessity of UNRWA is indisputable to the continuation of Palestinian life. Members of the jury, my second point addresses why Israel wants to prevent UNRWA from exercising its mandate. In the short term, Israel is pursuing the erasure of the Palestinian people in Palestine, including through forcible transfer. In Gaza, almost the whole of the population, some 1.9 million people, has been forcibly transferred multiple times through Israel's indiscriminate bombardment and starvation campaign. Following multiple calls by government ministers to depopulate Gaza and to resettle it with Israelis, on 5 February 2025, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, ordered the preparation of arrangements for what he euphemistically called the voluntary departure of Palestinians. But with this brazen suggestion that the departure of Palestinians would be voluntary, Israel is not merely insulting the world's intelligence, it is simply assuming that the world has none. After killing or injuring close to 240,000 Palestinians, after turning Gaza into a moonscape of dust and rubble with well over 70,000 tons or more of bombs, amounting to much more than what was dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined during World War II, after destroying or damaging over 92% of civilian housing, 88% of schools, 84% of health facilities, 95% of water and sanitation systems, and 92% of roads, use of this Orwellian language by Minister Katz must be seen for what it is, an open call to expel as many surviving Palestinians as possible. Members of the jury, my point here is this. The elimination of UNRWA is essential to the success of Israel's dreaded plans. Given the scope of UNRWA's capabilities in providing emergency relief, stability, and resilience to the Palestinian people in ways that no other organization can operationally do, it is painfully obvious why Israel insists on eliminating the agency. Quite simply, UNRWA is the last hope that the Palestinian people, particularly in the Gaza Strip, have of surviving Israel's genocide against them. More broadly, Israel's long-term purpose behind destroying UNRWA rests in its complete denial of the existence of the Palestinian people, and in particular, the status, rights, and claims of millions of Palestine refugees to return, to restitution, and to compensation. But you needn't take my word for it. The Prime Minister of Israel has openly admitted as much on multiple occasions, including, it must be stressed, years before 7 October 2023. For instance, on 11 June 2017, Prime Minister Netanyahu proclaimed, and I quote, "I regret that UNRWA, to a large degree, by its very existence, perpetuates and does not solve the Palestinian refugee problem. Therefore, the time has come to disband UNRWA," end quote. Similarly, on 7 January 2018, Mr. Netanyahu stated, quote, "UNRWA is an organization that perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem. It also perpetuates the narrative of the right of return, as it were, in order to eliminate the state of Israel. Therefore, UNRWA needs to pass from the world," end quote. Of course, as members of the jury will no doubt be aware, Palestinian refugee rights are not legally contingent on UNRWA's existence. Nevertheless, according to Israel's strained logic, it is UNRWA, not Israel itself, that is to blame for the continued exile and deprivations of the Palestine refugees. And to avoid having to answer for this, therefore, Israel simply wants to do away with UNRWA. Members of the jury, I now turn to the third and final issue I wish to address, namely the matter of how Israel has pursued its objective of destroying UNRWA. And in this respect, Israel's approach has been threefold. First, Israel has systematically attacked UNRWA personnel and property. Only since October 2023, well over 300 UNRWA personnel have been killed by Israel in the Gaza Strip alone, with hundreds more wounded, many for life. Numerous others have been abducted from UNRWA premises and tortured. In Gaza, Israel has damaged or destroyed well over 310 UNRWA premises since October 2023. These include schools and healthcare facilities, many converted into shelters in which thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed or injured. In the West Bank, Israel has repeatedly violated its obligation to protect UNRWA premises and property, including UNRWA headquarters in East Jerusalem, which has been subjected to arson attacks by Israeli settlers and is now earmarked for settlement, having been shuttered by Israel in January. Second, Israel has attempted to undermine the agency's vital sources of funding. On 26 January 2024, the very same day that the International Court of Justice issued its first provisional measures order in the South Africa case, after determining that famine was around the corner in Gaza, Israel urged UNRWA donors to defund the agency, alleging involvement of UNRWA staff in the attack of 7 October. The resulting funding pause by 18 states added massive pressure on agency operations at a time when millions of beleaguered Palestinians needed UNRWA the most. Israel has repeatedly claimed, without substantiation, that upwards of approximately 12% of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of what it calls terrorist groups. But as the court is well aware, or rather as the jury is well aware, forgive me, unsupported allegations do not a fact make, no matter how loudly shouted or oft repeated. The fact is that UNRWA has always responded to Israeli allegations in substance, in good faith, and in a timely fashion. I will return to that in a moment. Third, Israel passed 2 anti-UNRWA laws in October 2024, which entered into effect on 28 January 2025. This legislation has had grave implications for UNRWA operations across the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem, over which Israel has unlawfully asserted its sovereignty as affirmed by the ICJ in 2024. This includes, again, the shuttering of UNRWA headquarters and schools in East Jerusalem and the complete non-cooperation with UNRWA in the Gaza Strip. This legislation, together with its broader attacks, Israel's broader attacks against UNRWA, have been roundly rejected by both the Security Council and the General Assembly, indeed by the International Court of Justice. And it is there that I would like to conclude. I'd like to draw your attention to some of the findings of the ICJ of 22 October 2025, just a few days ago. In particular, the court has held that Israel's allegations against UNRWA have not been substantiated, that it is not possible to replicate the capacity of the United Nations acting through UNRWA to ensure that the population of the Gaza Strip is adequately provided for, and that Israel is therefore obligated to agree to and facilitate relief schemes to the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory through UNRWA, and not to impede such relief. In this regard, it is notable that the court went to pains to note that Israel has inadequately supplied the population of the Gaza Strip, to put it conservatively, and repeatedly reminded Israel of its obligation not to use starvation of the civilian population as a method of war. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and I stand ready to answer questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Imses. And about politics of genocide, Daryl Lee will be speaking. Do we have a connection? Mr. Lee, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. The time is yours.
Thank you. My name is Daryl Lee. I'm a legal scholar, international human rights lawyer, and anthropologist. I lived and worked throughout Palestine, including in the Gaza Strip. I'm here in my capacity as an expert on international law, settler colonialism, and the question of Palestine. In the 10 minutes I have, I will address some of the problems stemming from the Genocide Convention, the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to be precise, and how some of those problems have manifested in the proceedings before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, concerning Palestine. Over the course of these proceedings, here in Istanbul and virtually, the jury has heard overwhelming evidence that the State of Israel has committed numerous acts that, under most reasonable interpretations of international law, meet the definition of genocide. I will not belabor that point here. Instead, my task is to remind you that law, including the law of genocide, is not made or interpreted in a vacuum of objectivity free of politics. I'll do my best to provide a map of the politics of genocide and genocide accusations and the duopoly that the United States and Israel have sought to maintain over the term for decades. And I will remind you that it is people, not courts, and movements, not jurists, who remain the ultimate worldly arbiters on what is just. I'd like to show the jury only one image today. These are two hilltops on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. At the bottom of this image is Yad Vashem, the State of Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, a site of pilgrimage for visiting dignitaries and schoolchildren alike. At the top of the image, barely a kilometer away on a neighboring hill, is the spot where the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin once stood. Deir Yassin was the site of one of the most infamous massacres of the 1948 Nakba, and some of its stone homes are still standing as they have been repurposed by an Israeli mental health hospital. So the most famous monument to the most widely commemorated mass atrocity of modern times sits adjacent to an actual site of mass atrocity whose memory is actively repressed every day. 1948, of course, was not only the year of the Nakba. It was also the year that the international community adopted the treaty that would enshrine genocide as a crime under international law. Many of the states that signed the Genocide Convention of course, had committed mass atrocities of their own. Thus, care was taken to craft a legal definition riddled with enough ambiguities and loopholes to afford states a degree of plausible deniability. Thus, a chasm emerged. Morally and ethically, genocide came to be known as the crime of crimes, a superlative form of mass atrocity that should generate unconditional, absolute, and universal opposition. On the other hand, genocide had a narrow and highly technical legal definition around notions of specific intent and protected groups that left it open to manipulation by states. Powerful states could thus use genocide as a rhetorical cudgel against their foes while avoiding accountability for themselves and their allies. The State of Israel has for decades mobilized the memory of the Shoah, or the genocide of European Jews by the Nazis and their allies, as a justification for dispossessing the Palestinian people. According to this logic, European Jews have survived history's greatest crime, and therefore any crime Israel commits is necessarily trivial by comparison. For its part, the United States, especially from the 1990s onward, has repeatedly referenced its role in liberating the Nazi concentration camps to argue that it has a unique responsibility as the most militarily powerful country on earth to combat genocide around the world. According to this logic, the United States ended history's greatest crime, and therefore any crime the United States commits is necessarily trivial by comparison. Of course, these arguments are profoundly misconceived and ahistorical. They erase the collaboration between the Zionist movement and the Nazi regime. They erase the wartime refusal of the United States to accept Jewish refugees fleeing persecution. They erase the role played by the Soviet Union in defeating Nazism. And they erase the fact that the United States is itself a settler colonial state founded in genocide. Nonetheless, the jury should take note that the United States and Israel have forged a rhetorical duopoly over genocide to justify their respective agendas, portraying Israel as the ultimate righteous victim and the United States as the ultimate righteous avenger. The jury will be aware that over the past 2 years, the politics of genocide have been challenged like never before by the events in Palestine. In December 2023, the Republic of South Africa instituted genocide proceedings against Israel before the International Court of Justice. The following month, the ICJ issued a preliminary ruling finding these claims to be plausible. It also ordered Israel to refrain from violating the Genocide Convention, but it did not heed South Africa's request for an order directing Israel to end the war on Gaza. As the situation in Gaza continued to deteriorate, the ICJ dithered for months before belatedly demanding a ceasefire only around Rafah, which Israel blithely bulldozed aside like so many Palestinian homes. Since then, the court has been largely quiet as it considers the arguments of the respective parties, including the numerous intervening states. On the one hand, the inability of the ICJ to stop genocide is a reminder of the gap between the aspirations of international law and the realities of power politics. On the other hand, the expectation that any court can simply make a declaration and expect powerful states to automatically fall in line perhaps puts too heavy a burden of expectation on courts in the first place. There is no law in the world that is self-executing. To the extent law seems to work properly, quote unquote, it is because there is a political arrangement that makes it possible. This is not to defend or make excuses for the ICJ. It is to remind you, the jury, that at the end of the day, it is popular mobilization that supplies the conscience of humanity and that can build power to achieve justice. The ICJ's preliminary ruling shattered the taboo around accusing Israel of genocide. It radically reshaped the contours of public debates in the West, and it irreparably damaged Israel's ability to assume moral supremacy. It provided activists around the world a powerful rhetorical tool and helped legitimize their cause. I want to stress that this outcome was not a natural or inevitable response to the scale and brutality of Israel's actions. History is full of many examples of mass atrocities committed in plain sight that elicit far more muted reactions. Rather, it was popular mobilization that made it possible. The steadfastness of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, from Beit Hanun to Rafah, has inspired a global solidarity mobilization that has challenged the US-Israeli duopoly on the genocide concept, and with it, their ability to tame public criticism. This mobilization, of course, has come at steep personal cost, first and foremost for Palestinians themselves facing genocide, and to a far lesser extent, those protesting across the world who have faced the truncheons of police and the loss of livelihoods. Nonetheless, we cannot relent. While the consensus in the human rights community that Israel has committed genocide grows stronger with each passing day, it is not inconceivable that the ICJ may ultimately absolve Israel of the charge. Of greatest concern here is that it may adopt the absurd theory that an act can be considered genocidal if the only possible motivation is to destroy a protected group. This could rule out, for example, the notion that a state might be pursuing a political goal of defeating an enemy army concurrently with trying to destroy the civilian population. Under this standard, for example, the genocide in Rwanda would not be considered a genocide. Once again, it is only sustained popular pressure, including through venues like this tribunal that can push the ICJ and other institutions to align themselves with justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And about critique of the UN system, for the next minutes, Craig Mockebeyer will be speaking. Mr. Mockebeyer, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. We can hear you too, loud and clear. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished members of the Jury of Conscience, members of the Tribunal, ladies and gentlemen. Throughout the genocide, senior UN officials have adopted a kind of rhetorical shield that allows them to avoid taking a principled stand on the genocide in Palestine. Quote, only a court can determine a genocide, they say. But this is a calculated dodge because they fear a backlash from the perpetrator, from its powerful allies, and from abusive Israel proxy organizations. Only a court can decide, can be claimed about any crime, about which they never hesitate to comment. The same officials regularly invoke the word terrorism without the need for a judicial decision. Furthermore, the organization has obligations of genocide prevention, which is a logical impossibility after the crime has already occurred and a court has concluded its proceedings. This distinguished jury is the diplomacy of fear, and that has been the dominant response of the political corridors of the UN to the genocide in Palestine. But such moral abdication in the case of Palestine is not new at the UN. Indeed, the coincidence in 1948 of the adoption of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, and the horror of the Nakba that same year, was more than just a historical contradiction. It was also the birth of a virus, the virus of the Israel exception to international law, that has haunted the organization for decades, buttressed Israeli impunity, carved out space for genocide, and eroded the very legitimacy and sustainability of the UN itself. Today, Palestine sits directly on the fault line between those who believe that the global order should be determined by deference to power, great power politics, aggression, colonialism, and imperialism, and those who demand the building of a reliable international system constructed on international cooperation, human rights, equality, self-determination, and the rule of international law. Indeed, the genocide in Palestine has revealed the tendency, hardwired into the system from the start, to compromise mandates and principles in deference to state power. But this genocide has also underscored that there are, in fact, two UNs. The first is the UN of the Charter norms, constitutionally grounded in a mission of human rights and peace and development and international law. This is the UN of the human rights treaties, of the independent UN human rights monitors, of the International Court of Justice. It is the UN in which the use of force is prohibited in all but a few narrowly defined circumstances. This is the UN of decolonization, the UN in which all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and in which peoples have the right to self-determination. It is the right in which colonialism, apartheid, gross violations of human rights, and genocide are absolutely prohibited. The UN that once officially recognized that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And it is the UN in which officials rang the genocide alarm bell as far back as October of 2023. But members of the jury, there is another darker UN, a UN that permitted the colonization of Palestine, partitioned the land against the will of the indigenous people, ratified the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by recognizing Israel in 1948, and tolerated decades of apartheid. It is the UN that suspended the application of international law for 3 decades in favor of a disingenuous political process called Oslo, under which the Palestinians were told that they, unprotected by international law, must negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that the mediator for the process would be the world's sole superpower and Israel's closest ally. And it is the UN that has remained almost entirely silent as genocide raged across the land, trepidatiously avoiding any reference to the crime or to its root causes. The UN that was unable even to order a ceasefire or to hold perpetrators accountable while they were openly committing genocide. This is the UN of moral failure. As the genocide in Palestine has shown, the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the only body with formal enforcement power, is the most obvious example of failure by design. That power has been used throughout the genocide by the US to prevent any meaningful act of protection for Palestinian civilians, enforcement of international law, or accountability for Israeli perpetrators. 6 successive vetoes have been exercised by the United States since October of 2023, bringing US vetoes to protect Israeli impunity to a total of 50. No sanctions have been imposed by the Council on the perpetrator regime, no protection mobilized, no judicial decisions enforced, and the Israeli regime even remains a full member of the United Nations with full privileges, despite its perpetration of the ongoing genocide, its apartheid status, its denial of the self-determination of the Palestinian people, serial acts of aggression against its neighbors, unlawful occupation of the territory of 3 surrounding nations, a transnational terrorist attack with booby-trapped pagers, numerous assassinations, and frequent attacks on the United Nations itself, its staff, and facilities. For its part, the General Assembly has adopted important resolutions to respond to the genocide in the face of a captured and moribund Security Council, and the Assembly has declared that all countries must comply with the detailed findings of the ICJ. It has adopted resolutions demanding a ceasefire, and most significantly adopted a resolution in September of 2024 endorsing the entirety of the findings of the International Court of Justice and its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, as well as the provisional measures of the ICJ in Israeli genocide. And historically, it set a 1-year deadline for full Israeli compliance. But members of the jury, that deadline expired 5 weeks ago without any meaningful action. Instead, Israel's friends in the UN rallied to forestall any meaningful action for accountability and redress, instead to create a strategy of distraction by adopting the so-called French-Saudi proposal, now named the New York Declaration, which makes no mention of genocide or apartheid, diverts attention away from human rights accountability under international law and into a loose political process and the promise of a possible limited state at some point in the future. That would deploy a proxy occupation force, further denying Palestinian agency and self-determination, compel Palestinians once again to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and work to normalize the Israeli regime as it consolidates its conquest of Palestine. In sum, the true focus of these initiatives is not on saving Palestine, but rather on saving Israel and Zionism, even in the wake of a genocide. This is the UN of complicity. And as we speak today, Security Council diplomats are working to merge the lawless French-Saudi plan with Donald Trump's atrocious 20-point colonial dictate for Palestine in an attempt to legitimize it with the imprimatur of the UN Security Council. And so, on the UN's watch, Israeli impunity continues just as Palestinian subjugation continues. Even as the horror drags on and Israel shatters record after record for civilian bloodletting, the UNGA has yet to use the full range of powers at its disposal. It continues to recognize Israel's credentials, and the regime's voting rights remain intact. Even as it attacks and smears the organization, blocks its operations, raids and demolishes its installations, and abducts, detains, tortures, and murders its staff. The UNGA has yet to reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, has established no tribunal for accountability, has not moved to mandate a UN protection force to protect Palestinians from a genocidal regime bent on their destruction, even though it has the power to do so under the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And it has not solidified earlier calls for sanctions, a military embargo, and measures to isolate the Israeli regime and hold its officials to account. For its part, Switzerland, acting as depositary of the Fourth Geneva Convention, scandalously declined to convene the Conference of High Contracting Parties requested by the General Assembly, owing to objections from Israel, the US, and their allies, and despite the fact that it was requested by an overwhelming number of UN member states. And beyond intergovernmental bodies, the tendency to compromise UN principles in deference to power, especially that of the US and its Western allies, has also been evident in the positioning of the UN Secretary General and senior UN officials, where the Israel exception has been in plain view. Throughout the genocide, the UN's senior-most political leadership, including the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, have remained unable or unwilling to directly address the genocide or even to utter the word. Instead, taking refuge behind the safe language of armed conflict, the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday, and the necessity of humanitarian aid. Adopting a kind of both-sidesism, which fails to recognize the true dynamics of colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, genocidaire and victims. And barely a whisper has been heard about accountability for Israeli perpetrators. As such, the significant reserve of moral and political power of the senior-most podiums of the organization have been left largely untapped. Root causes, normally the first area of inquiry in conflict resolution, have been almost entirely ignored. The seizure of Palestine in 1948, its colonization, the theft of land and homes within the Green Line, the ethno-nationalist state, the violent supremacism of Zionism, the system of apartheid, systemic inequalities, official racism and dehumanization, the plight of generations of Palestinian refugees, and colonial domination, none of these have received any significant attention in the statements of the political leadership or in the succession of failed political processes launched since Oslo. Perhaps worse, the political offices operating under the direct authority of the Secretary General have not only largely ignored the genocide in Palestine, but in some cases, under external, mostly Western political pressure, and without exercising the most basic level of due diligence, have non-critically reinforced the Israeli regime's fabricated propaganda for genocide and its justifications for international crimes. Month after month, as the alarm bell raged and as many human rights monitors repeatedly warned of genocide, the Secretary General's special advisor on the prevention of genocide remained entirely silent on the carnage in Gaza, prompting petitions from UN staff and civil society calls for her firing. The Secretary General's special advisor on sexual violence in conflict, under an organized pressure campaign from the Israeli regime and its proxy organizations in the West, refused to debunk and at times reinforced Israel's fabricated accusations of a Hamas campaign of mass rape, and therefore contributed to the regime's false narratives designed to manufacture consent for genocide. And the Office of the Special Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict, under political pressure from and through the Secretary General, repeatedly censored its own annual listing of countries systematically violating the rights of children to remove Israel and ensure its continued impunity. This is the UN of failure. But distinguished members of the jury, as I conclude, I want to leave you with 3 points of light in the international system. In sharp contrast to the historic failings of these intergovernmental bodies and the political offices of the Secretary General, the independent human rights mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva have maintained a principled, law-based approach to their human rights monitoring and reporting duties. An especially important role has been played by the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who, in the face of a sustained campaign of harassment, smears, death threats, and slander campaigns by the governments of Israel, its allies and proxies, as well as official U.S. sanctions, Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has been undeterred, producing a series of meticulously documented analytical reports on the genocide and on its colonial roots, maintaining a continuous visible media presence and close collaboration with Palestinian and global civil society. And several other thematic rapporteurs, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry, have also worked diligently to defend the human rights of the people of Palestine and to build the case for Israeli accountability, despite efforts to discredit or silence them. The jury will note that throughout the genocide, the contrast between the principled, fact-based, law-centered, and accountability-focused approach of the special procedures on the one hand, and the equivocal, politicized, lawless, and trepidatious rhetoric of the Secretariat on the other, could not be starker. And of course, the International Court of Justice is also a part of the UN system. Thanks to the court, the Israeli regime is today on trial for genocide. The court has issued several rounds of provisional measures and historic advisory opinions finding apartheid and racial segregation, and has held that the occupation of Palestine is entirely unlawful. And just this week, it found the regime's obstruction of aid, attacks on UNRWA, and use of starvation as a method of war are breaches of international legal obligations. These pronouncements provide even more proof of the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause and the illegitimacy of Israel's project and crimes in Palestine. Finally, the UN also includes courageous humanitarian workers from a host of agencies, foremost among them the people of UNRWA, who to this day continue to operate in the depths of Gaza's hell to support the survivors of genocide, despite the smears of the Israeli regime and its collaborators in Washington and Europe, despite the bombs, the bullets, the widespread destruction, the targeting of UN facilities, the abduction and torture of countless UNRWA staff, and the murder of more than 370 of them, many along with their families. They represent the best of the United Nations system, they embody its highest principles, and they deserve our unwavering solidarity. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Makaber. And the role of Gaza in the current experimental juncture will be the topic about which Ms. Mary Kaldor will be speaking. Ms. Kaldor, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much.
I hope you can hear me. Hello, my name is Mary Kaldor. I'm Professor Emeritus of Global Governance at the London School of Economics in Britain. And I suppose what I want to say in my evidence is along the lines of the last speaker's idea of chinks of life. The Gaza People's Tribunal can be viewed as part of a worldwide social movement committed to drawing attention to the ongoing tragedy that has been described so vividly that is being inflicted on the Palestinian people. According to the Armed Conflict Vacation and Events data, some 48,000 demonstrations were held between 7th of October 2023 and 25th of September 2024 in 137 countries. And the vast majority, 99%, were peaceful. The scale of the protests has continued since then. This movement, and I think it's incredibly important, involves the process of constructing, strengthening, and spreading international norms relating to war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, apartheid, and the crime of famine. A whole new generation is learning and teaching others about the salience of global human rights and the extent to which international institutions act really does depend on global public opinion. I use the term experimental juncture to describe turbulent periods in history when political institutions are out of kilter with far-reaching economic, social, and technological change. It's similar to what the Italian Marxist Gramsci called the interregnum, when the old is dying and the new cannot be born. What Gramsci called morbid symptoms include the wars in Palestine, Ukraine, and Sudan, the harsh treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, the rise of or return of racism, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism, the failure to deal with the floods, fires, and droughts associated with climate change, or the crimes associated with extreme inequality, the spread of disease, or financial recklessness. The reason I use the term experimental juncture is to draw attention to the role of political agency. Experimental junctures are crises of political authority. They're existential moments when the political class has to act, but they don't know how to. So they draw on ideas prevalent in society, and some of these ideas are truly terrible and make things worse, like killing Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, or invading other countries in the 20th century. It's only when politicians adopt or are forced to compromise over some of the better ideas that some sort of consensual narrative is re-established, giving birth to the new. The adoption of those ideas can be described as social innovation, and what it involves is the institutionalization of social movements. Institutionalization means that part of the agenda is adopted by the political authority and that the movements or parts of the movement get transformed into formal institutions, such as political parties, trades unions, or NGOs. Institutionalization is always an imperfect compromise and often involves the marginalization of more radical groups or movements. In the past, experimental junctures were associated with major hegemonic wars. The last great experimental juncture lasted from 1914 to 1945 and included 2 devastating world wars in which something of the order of 70 million people were killed. Both decolonization and the welfare state, and I should add the United Nations, were the innovations that came out of the compromises needed to win the Second World War. The withdrawal of the British from Palestine was part of the decolonization process, but as was also the case in Ireland and India, it was linked to ethnic partition that left a lasting bloody legacy, in particular in Palestine. As so many of the previous speakers have stressed, this involved the denial of self-determination for the Palestinians, as well as repression, war, and occupation, and now genocide. Ideas about human rights, crimes against humanity, or genocide also emerged during that period, but the subsequent Cold War and the rise of the return of geopolitics, the geopolitical mindset constrained their realization. Now, the Cold War ended not just because of its own contradictions, but more importantly, as a consequence of a worldwide movement for democratization that led to the end of military regimes in Southern Europe, Latin America, and Asia, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the 1989 revolutions in Europe. These movements were global, not only in the sense that they were everywhere, but because they were able to use transnational links to leverage human rights legislation. For instance, the 1975 Helsinki Agreement in Europe. The legacy of those movements was a new post-Cold War discourse about peace, human rights, humanitarianism, and civil society, as well as new institutions, the peace and humanitarian machinery of the UN and other multilateral institutions, the OSCE, the EU, the AU, or the International Criminal Court, among others, as well as the dramatic growth of international NGOs. Alas, that discourse, sometimes referred to as the liberal peace, for all its shortcomings, and there were shortcomings, was blown off course both by the renewed militarism of the United States, Russia, China, and other powers, and by the associated spread of free market fundamentalism. Neoliberalism led to the rise of new oligarchic classes who benefited from privatization and contracting out, as well as growing inequality, and who are inextricably linked to the rise of the authoritarian populist right, and I would add the undermining of the UN and the way it's supposed to function in these situations. It's their political resistance to any form of action that might address our current ills, and their apparent influence over the public political center ground that gives rise to the morbid symptoms that Gramsci talked about. Indeed, they tend to favor those experiments that come out of the far-right movements and make things worse. Yet, turn to an enhancement of those post-Cold War concepts is a precondition for exiting the experimental juncture, for bringing an end to the current turbulence. Of course, it might never happen. There's a risk of renewed hegemonic warfare that would inevitably lead to human extinction, or more likely, the current spread of intractable political and criminal violence in which armed groups, criminal gangs, ethnic warlords, as well as oligarchic regimes like Israel, benefit from violence, both economically and in terms of mobilizing extremist ideologies, and that could continue in time and space. But if there is to be a way out, then the Gaza movement, including the actions of the ICC and the ICJ, the way that groups and institutions have cooperated to document the crimes being committed, and the impact on global public opinion, will have played a key role in normalizing the kind of principles which will be required to underpin a new, more human-centered phase of history and provide the basis for more constructive experimentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kaldor. And next topic is the Gaza Tribunal as an alternative jurisprudential paradigm. Ashibali and Masuki Nisaya.
Thank you. We are very grateful to have this opportunity to address the jury. And we want to begin by acknowledging that standing international courts are seized of the question of Palestine and more specifically of Gaza, both in the contentious case before the International Court of Justice and in the criminal case before the International Criminal Court. And yet we view the Gaza Tribunal as an important, indeed essential complement to the work of standing international institutions and courts. We understand the Gaza Tribunal to be situated in a long submission. We understand that these tribunals have historically arisen and are required again today, and that need is being answered by the Gaza Tribunal because existing institutions are in fact incapable of providing a real-time intervention capable of delivering relief, in this instance to the Palestinian people, or providing real-time adjudication of their persecution and the violations of their rights to be protected from genocide. We have seen provisional measures issued and arrest warrants as well, and neither has generated the political will necessary for compliance, let alone enforcement. In our oral presentation, we wish to emphasize the ways in which the Gaza Tribunal may serve a complementary function to these standing international institutions in light of their limitations, and to also address what will be required for the tribunal to be able to realize that potential. I will address the question of the complement that the Gaza Tribunal may serve to fulfill in addressing two gaps in the international order, and I will then turn to my colleague Vasuki Nesia to address the ways in which we believe the Gaza Tribunal can realize its potential through the work of the jury of conscience and the positions that they must articulate. We understand that there are two critical gaps in the international order that make it all but impossible for standing international institutions to adequately meet this moment. The first of those are the geopolitical limitations of the international order as presently constituted, primarily as expressed through the UN Security Council, of which Craig Mokhiber and many others have spoken eloquently. The Security Council is an obstacle to realizing the potential for collective security based on law in the international order, notwithstanding the fact that it was designed in part to be able precisely to deliver such collective security informed by law. It serves as an obstacle to realizing this potential because the veto power within the Security Council expresses the geopolitical ambitions and hegemonic designs of powerful actors that are willing to countenance ongoing genocide and refuse to recognize the threat that genocide presents to international peace and security. As a consequence of the Security Council's absolute failure to realize its own obligations with respect to collective security, there can be no hope that the executive function of the international organization tasked with maintaining international peace and security will be able to meet this moment. In addition, there are jurisprudential limitations that impede both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court of addressing the needs of the moment. As just two examples, I would point to the fact that neither of these institutions is able to hold corporations accountable for their manifest complicity in the commission of genocide, in the surveillance capitalism that has now been inflicted upon Palestinians in the West Bank, and in the ongoing trade in death and destruction that fuels Israeli state policies towards Palestine. In addition, neither institution is capable of instantiating a non-prosecutorial vision of justice and accountability that would, for example, provide a reparative account of the kinds of justice to which Palestinians are entitled beyond models of enforcement and criminal accountability on which the ICC is premised, and beyond the limitations of sovereign adjudication to which the ICJ is limited. There is no forum, as presently constituted in the international order, to vindicate the self-determining interests of the Palestinian people, and there is no international institution that is capable of giving voice to the demands of global civil society as expressed through solidarity movements such as the Sumud flotillas that we have witnessed over the last year. The structural limitations of what international institutions and international doctrine can address further reinforce the gaps that I've defined. For example, international law expresses a clear doctrinal bias in favor of states, thereby necessarily engendering an unequal playing field for the claims of stateless peoples like the Palestinians, or for the expression of the self-determining claims of communities that have been deprived the recognition of their sovereignty to date. In addition, doctrinally, international law is limited in its capacity to conceptualize collective harms and imagine meaningful collective redress. I've already mentioned the inability to express meaningful reparative claims to justice, and that's only one of the manifold ways in which collective claims fail to be cognizable or rendered legally recognizable in the international legal order. In part, this is because there's an enormous challenge in disentangling international law doctrine and legal institutions from the afterlives of the colonial and imperial orders that issued and engendered their shape, their structure, and their normative content. It's possible through the work of people's tribunals to imagine not only alternative fora, but also alternative jurisprudential paradigms through which a reparative vision of justice can be articulated. The absence of a positive horizon for empowering Palestinian communities to define their own self-determining future through existing international institutions and existing international legal doctrine are fundamental flaws and gaps so profound that they call into existence a people's tribunal like the Gaza Tribunal, and of course invest that tribunal with the enormous responsibility to giving expression to those aspirations which have been so brutally repressed, not only through genocidal violence, but through the violence of the existing international order and its legal doctrines. I turn now to my colleague, Basuki Nesia, to continue our reflection based on our written submission and to address the jury of conscience in what positions it may take to fulfill the potential that is expressed through the complementary role that the Gaza Tribunal plays.
Many thanks, Professor Bali. My name is Vasuki Nesia. I'm a professor at NYU, and I'm here in my capacity as an expert on international law and co-author with Professor Bali and Ala Haya of a submission on alternative jurisprudential paradigms. In the 5 minutes I have, I will follow on Professor Bali's presentation by elaborating on how we believe that the limitations of existing approaches are not the horizon of our political and legal imagination. Rather, they are arguments for drawing on and building an alternative jurisprudential paradigm, and we believe this tribunal offers an opportunity to do precisely that. We would like to emphasize 4 dimensions of this opportunity. Firstly, we welcome the fact that the structure of this tribunal goes beyond a narrowly legalistic approach. Instead, it echoes indigenous and global South policies and practices and epistemic traditions that refuse to separate law from context. As you know, this tribunal draws on a tradition represented by Russell tribunals to offer a people's forum for international affairs. There are other important institutional innovations that offer inspiring precedent as well. For instance, truth commissions are among the most significant institutional innovations to emerge from the global South. Truth commissions offer important precedents as an institutional form that offers a more holistic approach to justice by giving due weight to history, analyzing root causes and structural dimensions of atrocity, and taking seriously the testimony of those persons most directly impacted. Over the past several decades, institutional forms such as the Russell Tribunals and Truth Commissions have enabled a reckoning with the past while connecting the dots between individual testimonies and national histories and counter-histories. Secondly, this is an opportunity to develop a broader understanding of the repertoires of custom that can democratize and pluralize the sources feeding international law. For instance, resisting a narrowly Eurocentric understanding of legitimate sources of law, we need to take seriously third world approaches to international law and other non-Western traditions, including that of stateless people and the ethical legal guidance of grassroots social movements such as BDS that treat Palestinian lived experience as foundational legal knowledge. In taking a broader approach to custom, these tribunals can model people-centered justice and hold the powerful to account. Thirdly, this is an opportunity to appreciate that solidarity has legal standing and legitimize the accountability claims from actors not directly harmed but bound by shared humanity and collective responsibility to prevent genocide. Over the last 50 years, the International Court of Justice has had a revolution in its own understanding of the significance of solidarity in establishing procedural standing when the court is dealing with erga omnes claims, namely obligations under international law that are owed to the entire international community, and the matter of genocide is surely that. Since 1955, when the Bandung Conference endorsed the UDHR in its final communique, representatives of the vast majority of the international community have situated human rights in relation to anti-colonial solidarity. The Declaration on the Right to Solidarity situates it as indivisible from self-determination, grounding it specifically in the challenge of preventing and removing the causes of asymmetries and inequities between and within states. Solidarity operates as a legal principle precisely when it challenges structural oppression and power imbalances. This is an opportunity to give due recognition to the mass solidarity that has been expressed by thousands of people marching in solidarity with the people of Palestine across the world. Dock workers refusing to load shipments, armed shipments bound for Israel, students building encampments, and the Sumud flotillas of solidarity. Fourth, the tribunal offers a bold, precedent-setting opportunity to recognize a people's right to self-determination without being cabined within statist models of recognition. The Palestinian people have a claim to self-determination that exceeds the state form. One source of inspiration here are fourth world or original nations approaches to sovereignty that go beyond the received model of Westphalian statehood to instead center stewardship of the land, citizenship, and hospitality. As we have elaborated in our written submissions, indigenous treaty-making practices, both formal and informal, embody these different values and support a people's jurisprudence that democratizes the right to self-determination. Drawing from the principles we have gestured to here, we would like to emphasize the opportunity to activate international law as a tool for an emancipatory jurisprudence rather than an end in itself. We argue that the Gaza Tribunal has the potential to exemplify how alternative jurisprudential paradigms can preserve the transformative ambitions of international law at its best, even when formal mechanisms fall short, but also being a much-needed complement to those formal mechanisms by generating space for legal innovation, amplifying marginalized voices, and helping bridge normative frameworks with political change. We ask the jury of conscience to issue calls that reach beyond traditional international law jurisdiction by, firstly, recognizing the expertise of Palestinians as chroniclers of their experience and authors of the norms defining their aspirations. Equally, providing the space to articulate non-statist models for the self-determination rights of the Palestinian people. In addition, adjudicating the complicity of and demanding accountability from third states and non-state actors, including weapons manufacturers, financial institutions, universities, tech companies, and other actors enabling genocide. And finally, bridging documentation with mobilization, creating tools for movements to enforce the norms that formal institutions establish but cannot implement, with attention to how its own findings can be crafted to educate and equip civil society actors, not just legal elites, turning legal knowledge into tools for building an alternative jurisprudence of international law from below. Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you very much for this elaboration. And now I'm opening short space for questions and answers for our members of the jury. So please, go on. If there are any questions, go on.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for the panel. It's mostly within the legal community, so I have a few questions. I'll try to be very brief. For Mr. Lee, when you talk about popular mobilization, demonstrations, protests, sit-ins, conferences, flotillas, vocal use of social media, other platforms, alternative media, and so on and so forth, do you have any other suggestions other than what people have been doing? Do you have any particular things that could be more effective? For Mr. Mukhaber, when we talk about the United for Peace mechanism, short of an armed conflict, what measures can states take to force the Zionist regime to allow aid, lift the siege, withdraw from Gaza and the West Bank? What countries could actually lead such efforts in your view? Also, we have the situation with the concept of armed resistance, since this has been enshrined in international law. Setting aside whether it's prudent, useful, or undesirable, how can a colonized people practice armed resistance without being maligned or without being, as the International Court of Justice or at the International Criminal Court has indicted the leaders of Hamas in that particular thing? How would that be practiced? The fourth question, very quickly, Turkey as a member state, a member of NATO, let's say it wants to provide aid to break the siege, deliver aid, and then it gets attacked by Israel. Is that a NATO breach? And the same goes with the Houthis. If they have the right to stop a genocide, what are the obligations of Egypt as a border state that has been complicit as well in placing the siege in having the siege against the Palestinians and not delivering aid? What obligations on that? And finally, can the UN and its agencies target corporations that are complicit in genocide? Do they have the jurisdiction over that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we begin with the answers, if I'm not wrong, Mr. Lee was the first one. I would like to kindly ask you to keep your answers short and precise. Thank you. Go on, Mr. Lee.
Unfortunately, I don't know if I have a short and precise answer to that question. I mean, obviously, more of everything, all of the above. A commitment to ungovernability, I think, is maybe an important way of thinking about it. And also to think about the way that people are situated differently around the world, right? I mean, the point that Vasuki made about the dock workers is very important. Colombia's coal boycott, which also is has its own strains. Everyone in the world, every regime in the world is linked to what's happening in Palestine in a different way, right? Everyone is differently situated in this system. So it's really about figuring out what the specific leverage point is wherever you are and kind of pressing on it as hard as possible. I apologize if that sounds very general, but unfortunately the question was also pretty broad, and it's difficult to be prescriptive at that level. I apologize.
Thank you. I'm Craig, I believe the next question was for you, if you've heard it right.
I heard several questions there, by all means. So on the Uniting for Peace, there is in fact a process that has gotten very little attention behind the scenes to bring a Uniting for Peace process forward, to bring a resolution forward for which there is a draft that includes things like the mandating of a consent-based protection force to be distinguished from the sort of colonial machinations of the Trump stabilization force or the proxy occupation of the stabilization force recommended by France and Saudi Arabia. This is a consent-based protection force that only would perform the functions of protection of civilians, the preservation of evidence of Israeli crimes, facilitation of the distribution of humanitarian aid, and help with reconstruction. But it also includes a number of measures that would pressure the Israeli regime to not interfere and actually to cease its many violations of international law. Measures like a military embargo, measures like sanctions, measures like the reactivation of the anti-apartheid mechanisms, and possibly the establishment of a tribunal. All of these things could be done by the General Assembly in the face of a U.S. veto. I just want to say this about it because it's often confused. It's true that the GA doesn't have enforcement power, but it has power, as we saw during apartheid in South Africa, to nevertheless adopt these measures and to compel, to use a word loosely, other states to join on in these initiatives in a multilateral initiative to bring this pressure to bear. So it can adopt sanctions, it can enforce them, but it can create a mechanism for other states to join on in applying them. So that's what could happen under Uniting for Peace. The question about the Houthis, for example, I've written on this that the Houthis made very clear, Ansar Allah in Yemen, that what they were doing was applying their obligations as they saw them to intervene to stop the genocide in Palestine. And they did this through the initiation of a blockade in the Red Sea in order, as they understood it, to meet their affirmative obligation to take measures to stop the genocide that was being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. The U.S. and its allies, on the other hand, in attacking the Houthis, had no authorization for the use of force and no justification for doing so, which makes it an act of aggression. It's completely the reverse of what was reported in Western media about what was happening or the way the Security Council was addressing these questions. So, it comes down to a question that, do the jus cogens and erga omnes norms of international law cease to exist with a Security Council veto? The answer to that has to be no. The Security Council is established by the UN Charter. The UN Charter is a treaty. It is situated within international law, not above international law. And so those highest norms of international law continue to apply, and among them is the prohibition of genocide, the affirmative obligation of states to stop genocide and to punish genocide and to prevent genocide, the self-determination of peoples, and all the other things that are mentioned in this context.
Thank you very much. Ardi, you have something else to add?
Yes, I just wanted to briefly address the issue of armed resistance. I actually think that while the right of peoples who are subjected to forms of foreign domination, colonial occupation, and so on, do have a right to exercise force in repelling such regimes against them. The one thing that people are often forgetting is that because the state of Palestine exists juridically, that is, it is a juridical entity, it behaves like a state on the international plane, even though its ability to exercise its sovereignty is impeded by an unlawful, aggressive, occupying power, imposing an apartheid regime on them. But because that state of Palestine exists, it also enjoys certain inherent rights of all states, including the right to use force when it is subjected to an illegal use of force or an armed attack, as lawyers call them, under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. They may invoke the right to use force to repel said armed attack. The important facts for the jury to make note of is that on the 19th of July, 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel's ongoing 58-year military occupation, which is a use of force, is in and of itself unlawful for being in violation of Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter, the prohibition on the use of force in international law. And as a result, that triggers the right of the state of Palestine to use force if it wishes, if it so wishes, and then to call assistance from other states to help it. Now, the real question, leaving aside the right to resort to force to repel the unlawful occupation, is whether or not there is sufficient political will, both in the aggrieved state immediately, Palestine, and then also third states to assist. Now, Craig has just mentioned the Yemenis, and that's pretty much as far as it's gone. But I would encourage the jury in how it appreciates what we call, as international lawyers, the jus ad bellum, the right to resort to force, that it takes into account the fact that the state of Palestine is a juridical entity. It exists. It appears before the International Court of Justice, as only states may do, and as a result enjoys an inherent right of self-defense when subjected to an illegal armed attack, which the court has already determined it is, in effect, without saying it in so many words. There are other rights that the state of Palestine enjoys inherently, including the right to of inviolability of their internal affairs, the right to territorial integrity and political independence. And what is most important, and I'll close on this, is that recently a series of Western states over the past month or so have recognized the state of Palestine, which for many seems to be a symbol, and it may very well end up being symbolic. However, there are entry points for use of this, and to make it worth the while. Because these states are supportive of Israel, because these states are arming Israel, because these states are giving diplomatic and military and economic support to Israel, because they trade with Israel. I'm talking now about Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, France, and others. There are entry points that these recognitions of the state of Palestine have furnished global civil society, all of them based on the fact that Palestine exists as a state and enjoys the right to have its political self-determination respected, and principles of self-defense respected, and so on. And so where there are inconsistencies with these recognitions, say for instance, statements made by France or Canada that certain political parties may not play a role in the future government of Palestine, these things clearly violate the right of the state of Palestine, which they are recognizing, to have their own politics and to also enjoy territorial integrity and political independence and so on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being part of the Gaza Tribunal. Thank you to the members of the jury. And yes, I guess I will conclude this part of today's session. It is time for lunch, and I'll see you at 2. Only one small call. You can approach to see the side events and everything else that is part of the Gaza Tribunal and these 4 days. So you will follow our team. They will take you to see the exhibits and the rest of the side events during the day. And after that, you're going to a lunch. Thank you very much.